Brand new banner brings brand new gimmicks, and by brand new gimmicks, I mean the 3 same gimmicks in the form of attuned, rearmed, and whatever else that matters. Oh yeah, Ascended. Except this time around, the only 2 gimmick units that we have are Ascended Merrick and Attuned Sheeta, so this guide is going to be a lot shorter than the usual ones, but Guard Echo still has a fair bit of stuff to talk about, so I figured I'd make the video regardless. Short, sweet, and to the point, let's get right into it. Guard Echo is surprisingly a close counterpart to Guard 4 in the sense that it has damage reduction and inflicts guard, hence the name Guard. The only difference being that it doesn't have as much damage reduction for the trade-off of being 20% for brave attacks, and it doesn't debuff attack. And it's about as basic as you can get when it comes to any sort of Echo skill. Usually they're a lot more watered down, but even though this is still a slightly weaker version of Guard 4, the fact that it's in an X slot makes it so much more versatile, because Guard in the B slot competes with so much nowadays that it really isn't worth running on pretty much any single unit unless they have basically everything else in their kit. That said, Guard Echo is still a fine addition when it comes to Echo skills. It has the main gimmick in Guard with a pretty lenient HP condition, 20% damage reduction, which may not be a lot, but it's still some form of damage reduction, and it applies to brave attacks, which Guard 4 doesn't, and it's on your B slot, which in my opinion is the biggest deal. And before I get into my own personal recommendations and combinations, there is something that is definitely worth prefacing if you don't know already. You cannot give this to any sort of unit that has a PRF skill unless they're an attuned or rearmed. I know this might be a dumb moment for a lot of people, but for the ones that aren't extremely sure or might end up giving it to somebody just in case, you have absolutely been warned. Make sure you don't do that. That being said, any sort of attuned or rearmed unit can absolutely use it, and well, I wouldn't say there are a whole lot of rearms and attuned that would definitely want to use Guard Echo in particular. It's still an option, especially in the future if you would rather give it to somebody who arguably would make great use of it. For now though, as far as attuned and rearmed units are concerned that would absolutely love Guard Echo, the only 3 that really come to mind are rearmed Robin, rearmed Ader, and rearmed Lucina. Robin can be made into a pretty decent far save, so with extra DR, Hardy Fighter, and Guard support, she's going to be able to soak a lot more hits, and she won't have trouble looping Aegis because of the breath built into her A slot. Aether is just extra damage reduction, especially for a mixed phase utility due to her A slot granting dual phase Surge Sparrow, and rearmed Lucina, it's mostly due to Arcane Threema having full tempo built into it, so offensively and defensively, shutting off specials is still a pretty big benefit in my opinion. And that isn't necessarily just tied to Lucina, you could give it to all sorts of Axe armors as well, and pretty much a lot of Arcane Threema users, period. Arcane Threema having full tempo is absolutely the icing on the cake when it comes to using Guard Echo in my opinion, and arguably will be the most appealing candidate when giving out the X slot. You can run a 1 cooldown Aegis far save build, either with Unity, Savalin, and the Distant Counter Seal. You're simply getting significantly more damage reduction, but you also have the added benefit of stacking even more stats in your A slot, or removing your armor weakness entirely, and it should generally make them better far save tanks. The only unit you will have to watch out for is somebody like Legendary Hinoka, but with Savalin's shield and Guard in your X slot, getting specials off that isn't pre-charged is going to be a lot more difficult. That being said, you could easily make somebody into a near safe with the same idea. Close defense, Hardy Fighter Pavis with Guard Echo slot, and you should be good to go on that front too. Of course, any of your infantry God Axes could easily do the same thing. You can run infantry's favorite skill, Finish, for healing and sustainability, Null Sea Disrupt, or Bulwark, depending on what kind of route you want to go down. Bulwark has the benefit of allowing you to get more support in without putting them at risk, and Null Sea Disrupt makes it so you can counter back a lot of foes that might otherwise have flash or sweep effects, and with Times Pulse it's always going to be on permanent godlike reflexes. You won't necessarily need it if you're running a Null Sea Disrupt set, because no matter what you're going to be able to counter back, but it is nice if you just want the pre-charge. Otherwise you could easily swap it out for some sort of smoke skill and run pulse support if you would much prefer that. But outside of godlike reflexes, you can run a miracle set with Pledge, Buffer, Finish. Buffer is also not completely necessary if you could outsource the pulses, but it is convenient nonetheless, especially since you could grab both Finish and Buffer from a Severa with relative ease. Arcane Threema with Miracle and Pledge makes it so that you can easily get it off on every second hit, and you should realistically be able to shrug off at least one singular hit, especially if you are running damage reduction skills. Otherwise, you could give it to somebody who has innate tempo, whether that's somebody like Fiora, Fargus, or Shannon. Doesn't even necessarily have to be them. Anybody that has some sort of innate tempo built into their weapon, or has some tempo support, and I'll get into that a bit later, is going to be able to take advantage of this with relative ease, mainly because it will shut off the foe from getting off any sort of special that isn't pre-charged, or or if they don't have tempo themselves. Fiora recently got a refine. She has Dragon Wall built into it. Guard Echo gives extra damage reduction, but that only applies in the enemy phase. You can still take advantage of player phase stuff if you really wanted to with Near Trace, so she's not necessarily just sitting there and doing nothing. Trying to take advantage of the damage reduction would be ideal, but also considering it is only 20%, it's not going to be a make or break if you also have to go into the player phase. In fact, in some scenarios, it's also really going to be good offensively because you won't be able to get retaliated back with a special in a lot of scenarios. Vargas is a free-to-play unit who scores extremely well in Arena. He has built-in tempo and guaranteed follow-ups, and Shannon got a recent refine, I believe about 2 or 3 months ago, but it's also just additional damage reduction and special manipulation gimmicks. But again, anybody with tempo effects should be able to get it off with no issue whatsoever. You also have Dragon users, and these are probably some of my favorite options when it comes to using Guard Echo, mainly because of their ability to run Scowl. Tiki, who has Scowl built into her weapon, can run Finish in the A slot. Other dragons can run Scowl in their A slot if they don't have it readily available built into their PRFs. Armors in particular, especially somebody like Nagi, can run 1 cooldown Aegis, similarly to how it was with the Arcane 3 users, and will make their sustainability much more grand. You also do have the inheritable Dragon Stones from both New Yorkanas that grant true damage reduction, so that in tandem with Counter Roar and the Dragon's Wrath Sacred Seal, they'll be able to shrug off a lot of damage and retaliate with a good amount of it back. And speaking of true damage reduction, it's again another natural fit. You can give it to anybody with true damage reduction such as Cherish, Rinka, Cormag, preferably somebody that doesn't have overlap with Guard itself, but it's not really going to be the biggest make or break a lot of the time. Really, the combination of true damage reduction with percent damage reduction makes it so a lot of the damage they would be taking is retroactively canceled out because it takes the percentage of what you're already reducing and then takes the true damage reduction and removes a flat amount. So generally speaking, having percent damage reduction around, even if you have it built into your weapon, any additional amount on top of Guard is always going to be a good thing to have lying around, especially if it doesn't come at the cost of any PRF skill. That being said, you also have Infantry Beasts who have access to full tempo as well, similarly to the Arcane 3 users. The only downside really being is that they will have to transform, and depending on the team lineup, it might be a bit more difficult. All these units, for example, could easily just run a full Dragon or Beast team. You don't necessarily have to, but it makes it so you don't have to run the Beast options, which is still a relatively decent benefit in my opinion. Keenan, for example, has dual phase Brave and access to Counter Roar, so giving that up for something like Beast follow-up isn't exactly the most ideal for his damage output, especially since it can be shut off for no follow-up. Valoria could easily use it for Gale Force strategies, and while she won't be getting the damage reduction properties in the player phase, shutting off specials that she would otherwise have to hit is still a massive benefit in my book. And you also have stuff like Flame Mordecai, or again, anybody with full tempo and infantry, which is most of them at this point, minus Groom Raphael, if I remember correctly, can still take advantage of Guard Echo extremely well if they have a consistent way of transforming. And lastly, you can easily just slap this on any sort of guard-bearing Gambit user. You can run tempo support instead if you really wanted to do that, or in random SD sessions where Flash of Steel is an option. Guard Echo is an incredibly useful tool because it gives everybody within 2 spaces of the captain full tempo, which is really, really great. Still, extra damage reduction could never hurt, and Guard is always a really decent defensive tool, especially since not everybody has access to full tempo or any sort of null guard at the moment. Even though they keep adding it more into the game, it's still nice regardless, even if it's just 20% damage reduction. And again, you could run somebody like Legendary Female Byleth who gives Drive full tempo, and that could easily make it so the foe won't be able to get any sort of special off. Again, as long as they don't have null guard themselves or a pre-charged special. And really, when it comes to Guard Echo's applications, I think these are probably some of the best options you have available to you. There's probably other stuff that you can do with it, and for what it's worth, it's still a readily applicable skill, mainly because it's not restricted to any sort of archetype or movement class or anything. So if you did want to give it out to units that you may not necessarily think are good options, maybe even somebody like Brave Marth, because it's still additional damage reduction and guard, which is still a really decent defensive option, then you could easily give it out. I think these are just decent enough sample builds if you are looking for a more general application, but I do think there are a lot of units that can easily make use of Guard Echo, and if you find somebody that you do plan on giving it to, let me know down below. And if you want to see more videos like this, make sure to like and subscribe, and until next time, I'll see you later.